Judge Howard Gates sat high on the bench, his gaze sharp, his mouth set in a smirk. He had built a reputation as a man who didn't just control his courtroom. He owned it. Lawyers feared him, defendants trusted him if they had the right connections, and the system seemed to bend to his will. His word was final, his rulings unquestioned. He had dismissed cases, buried evidence, and silenced attorneys who dared challenge him. To him, today was just another routine session, another day of making sure his friends stayed protected. What he didn't know was that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. He was about to underestimate Pam Bondi. The courtroom was packed. This was no ordinary trial. At the center of it all was Charles Lawson, a powerful developer accused of stealing millions in government funds. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but with Judge Gates presiding, everyone knew the case was anything but fair. Gates had already dismissed key documents before, ruled against prosecutors for no reason, and done everything he could to steer the trial in Lawson's favor. But Pam Bondi wasn't here to play along. She wasn't the type to back down, no matter how powerful her opponent was. She had spent her career taking on corruption, and today she was prepared for a fight. She knew how Judge Gates operated. She knew he would try to humiliate her, cut her off, and dismiss her case before she could get too far. But she also knew something he didn't. She had the one thing that could bring his entire world crashing down. As the trial began, the tension in the air was thick. Reporters sat on the edge of their seats, waiting for the usual display of arrogance from Judge Gates. The defense team, smug and confident, expected another easy victory. But what started as a routine hearing, filled with insults and power plays, was about to take a turn no one in that courtroom saw coming. Because in just a few minutes, the man who ruled over this courtroom would find himself in a place he never expected. Under arrest. Pam Bondi stepped into the courtroom with purpose. She had been in high-stakes cases before, had faced down powerful men who thought they were above the law. But today, something felt different. The air in the room was heavy, charged with something beyond the usual legal tension. She could see it in the way the defense attorneys sat. Too relaxed, too smug. She caught the way reporters whispered to each other, sensing that this trial wasn't going to be like the others. And then there was Judge Howard Gates, a man whose reputation had reached her long before she ever set foot in his courtroom. This case wasn't just about Charles Lawson, the wealthy developer accused of siphoning millions from government projects into his own pocket. It was bigger than that. If the full truth came out, it could unravel an entire web of corruption, pulling down people who had been untouchable for years. Bondi knew the risks, knew that men like Lawson didn't get away with things like this without help. And the man sitting at the bench, the one who would decide what evidence was allowed and what would be tossed aside, had a long history of making sure the powerful stayed protected. Judge Gates was known for his arrogance. He didn't just control his courtroom, he dominated it. Lawyers had walked in with solid cases only to leave in frustration, their strongest arguments ignored, their evidence dismissed on technicalities that barely made sense. He had a habit of ruling with a smirk, of letting defense attorneys say what they pleased while cutting off prosecutors the moment they became a problem. To many, he was less of a judge and more of a gatekeeper, deciding which cases saw justice and which ones quietly disappeared. Pam had no illusions about what she was walking into. This wasn't going to be a fair fight, but that didn't mean she was going to back down. As she took her seat at the prosecution's table, she felt the weight of the room shift toward her. She could feel the judge's presence even before he spoke, but he didn't acknowledge her right away. Instead, he flipped through a folder with deliberate slowness, making sure everyone in the courtroom could feel the silence stretch. It was a power move, the kind meant to remind her of her place. Finally, without even looking up, His voice cut through the quiet. "Ms. Bondi, I assume you've prepared something useful today, or are we just wasting everyone's time?" A few quiet chuckles rippled from the defense's side of the room. The smirks grew a little wider. The game had begun. Pam didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she met the judge's words with the kind of calm that came from experience. She had faced men like him before, men who thought that belittling someone was the same as controlling them. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "I believe the evidence will speak for itself." She kept her voice steady, letting it carry just enough weight. She wasn't here to play his game. She was here to win hers. The judge finally looked up, his expression unreadable. But Pam caught it. That flicker of something behind his eyes. Amusement? Annoyance? Or maybe just a man who realized that today wasn't going to go the way he had planned. Pam Bondi stood tall, her voice steady, as she handed over the first set of financial records. The documents showed exactly where the money had gone. Government funds meant for public projects rerouted into Charles Lawson's personal accounts. It was undeniable proof of fraud, the kind that should have made any judge take notice. But before she could even finish her sentence, Judge Gates let out an exaggerated sigh and leaned back in his chair. "Ms. Bondi," he drawled, flipping through the pages without real interest, "do you always insist on drowning people in paperwork?" A few quiet laughs echoed from the defense table. Lawson's attorneys exchanged smirks, already sensing the judge was on their side. Pam could almost hear what they were thinking. This case is as good as dead. But Pam wasn't rattled. She placed her hands on the table and met the judge's gaze, her expression calm. "Your Honor, if you'd prefer to continue making this personal, I'm happy to request a recess while we address any professional concerns you may have." The smirks faded. The courtroom went silent. For the first time, Judge Gates hesitated. It was just a flicker, but it was there. A moment of surprise that she hadn't backed down. He adjusted his robe and cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "This court doesn't have time for theatrics," he said sharply. "Proceed, but keep it brief," Pam continued, keeping her pace steady. She wasn't going to let him control the tempo. Every piece of evidence had been carefully chosen, and she laid out the next one, a contract proving that Lawson had overcharged the city by millions. She barely got a sentence out before the judge cut in again. "This case is frivolous," Gates announced. "Frankly, I'm not seeing anything that justifies wasting taxpayer dollars on a drawn-out trial." Pam clenched her jaw. He wasn't even pretending to be fair. She pressed on, introducing a key document, an email exchange between Lawson and a government official discussing kickbacks. The moment the papers hit the evidence table, something changed. The judge, who had been smug and dismissive, suddenly sat up a little straighter. His hand twitched as he reached for the paper, but he hesitated before touching it. Pam narrowed her eyes. That was the first real reaction she'd gotten out of him. She glanced at the defense table. Lawson's attorneys were no longer smirking. They were stiff, their eyes flicking between the judge and the document. Something was off, and then it hit her. Judge Gates wasn't just biased, he was nervous. Pam had walked into this courtroom thinking she was up against a corrupt judge protecting a powerful defendant. But now she realized it was deeper than that. This wasn't just about Lawson. The way Gates reacted to that one piece of evidence told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't dismissing the case because he thought it was weak. He was dismissing it because he had something to hide. Pam knew this was the moment. She reached for the next document in her stack, her fingers steady as she lifted it into the air. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and firm, "this is a financial transaction dated 3 years ago, a payment authorized by none other than Judge Howard Gates." She walked toward the evidence table, setting the document down with deliberate care. It was all there, a paper trail connecting Judge Gates to Charles Lawson's illegal dealings. His signature, bold and undeniable, sat at the bottom of a wire transfer that had no legal justification. For the first time, the entire courtroom shifted. Reporters who had been scribbling lazily suddenly straightened in their seats. The defense attorneys, who had been so smug just minutes ago, went rigid. Even the jury, which had seemed disengaged during most of the trial, was now locked in. But no one reacted more strongly than Judge Gates. His face, always full of arrogance, went pale. His fingers curled into the armrests of his chair, his jaw tightening. And then, in an instant, he slammed his gavel down. "This document will not be considered by this court," he barked. Gasps rippled through the room. A judge declaring key financial evidence inadmissible without even a pretense of a valid reason? It was too blatant, too desperate. He had just revealed his own panic for everyone to see. Pam didn't blink. She stepped forward, her voice calm. "Your Honor, you do realize this is a public hearing? That every person in this room just heard you strike down critical financial evidence, without explanation?" Silence. No one moved. The defense attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact. Reporters were already scribbling, some whispering to each other. The jury members weren't just watching now. They were leaning in, completely focused. Judge Gates's fingers tapped anxiously against his desk. His mask of control was slipping, and he knew it. Then, in a move that reeked of desperation, he leaned forward and motioned for Pam to approach the bench. She walked up slowly, keeping her expression unreadable. The judge lowered his voice, his tone laced with barely controlled fury. "Some fights aren't worth having, Ms. Bondi," he warned. Pam tilted her head slightly, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I don't scare easily, Your Honor." He glared at her, but she could see the uncertainty creeping into his eyes. He had spent years ruling his courtroom like a king, shutting down cases that threatened powerful people. But today, he had underestimated the one prosecutor who wasn't afraid to push back. And now, everyone was watching. Pam took a deep breath, letting the tension in the room build for just a second longer. Then, with a calm, deliberate motion, she pressed play on the small recording device in her hand. The voice that filled the courtroom was unmistakable. "Take care of it. I don't care how. Make sure she doesn't get her hands on those ledgers." Silence. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then, all at once, the room erupted. Reporters lunged for their phones and notebooks, whispering furiously to one another. The defense attorneys, who had spent the entire trial acting smug and untouchable, now looked like they wanted to sink into their chairs. The jury, once bored and uninterested, was now wide-eyed, their expressions shifting from confusion to realization. At the front of the room, Judge Gates sat frozen. His hands gripped the bench so tightly his knuckles went white. His carefully maintained composure cracked, just for a second. Then he forced a sneer. "I don't know where you got that recording," he snapped, his voice sharp with desperation. "But it's inadmissible." Pam didn't even flinch. She was ready for this. She reached into her folder, pulling out another document and holding it up for the entire courtroom to see. "This," she said, her voice steady, "is a legally obtained transcript of wiretap recordings. Not one, not two, but multiple conversations between Judge Gates and Mr. Lawson's team." The reaction was instant. Gasps rippled through the audience. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God!" A juror shook his head in disbelief. The defense attorneys sat frozen, their case crumbling before their eyes. Pam took a step closer to the judge, lowering her voice just enough to make the moment feel even heavier. "Your Honor, are you saying the court should ignore your own voice, captured on a legally authorized recording?" Judge Gates opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was caught, trapped by his own arrogance, and just like that, the courtroom exploded. Pam barely moved, but the slight tilt of her head was all the signal they needed. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. Their presence alone was enough to send a ripple of energy through the room. Whispers broke out, cameras clicked, and every eye in the courtroom shifted to the bench. Judge Gates's face twisted in disbelief. His fingers curled around the edge of his desk, gripping it as if holding on could change what was happening. "No," he scoffed, shaking his head. "No, this is ridiculous. You can't do this. I am the law in this courtroom." Pam didn't rush. She took her time standing up, adjusting her blazer as she turned to face him. Then, in a voice as steady as ever, she said, "Not anymore." The officers moved in. The click of the handcuffs echoed in the silent courtroom. Judge Gates barely reacted at first, as if his brain couldn't process what was happening. But when they pulled him away from his bench, reality finally sank in. His face drained of color. His mouth opened, then closed, as if searching for words, for some last shred of control. But there was nothing left to say. The reporters didn't miss a second. Cameras flashed. Pens flew across notepads. Headlines were already being written. The jury exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from shock to something closer to satisfaction. They had walked into this trial expecting one thing, but now they were witnessing something much bigger, a reckoning. As Judge Gates was led past the defense table, the once confident attorneys looked away, avoiding his gaze. Even Charles Lawson, the man he had tried so desperately to protect, sat stone-faced, offering no help. The final humiliation came as Gates reached the courtroom doors. A reporter's voice cut through the murmurs. "Judge Gates, do you have anything to say about your arrest?" The judge turned his head slightly, his lips pressed into a thin line. But before he could even try to answer, the officers pushed the doors open, leading him out of the room, out of his courtroom, out of his power, and out of the life he once controlled. Charles Lawson shot up from his chair, his face slick with sweat. His hands twitched at his sides, fingers gripping the air like he was searching for something to hold on to. "We can work something out," he blurted, his voice cracked, raw with desperation. Pam didn't flinch. She took a slow, measured step toward him, folding her arms. "You seem nervous, Mr. Lawson," she said, her voice calm, almost amused. "Why is that?" Lawson swallowed hard. He knew. Everyone in the courtroom knew. Judge Gates had been his shield, his safety net. And now, with Gates in handcuffs, Lawson was exposed. The powerful developer who had once smirked through hearings, untouchable behind his money and connections, suddenly looked very small. He sank back into his chair, hands trembling as he rubbed his face. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Lawson barely heard him. He was doing the math in his head, and the numbers weren't adding up in his favor. Finally, he exhaled sharply and muttered, "I'll cooperate." Pam didn't react right away. She simply waited, letting the weight of that moment settle over the room. Then, in a voice steady and unwavering, Lawson continued, "Judge Gates was just one part of it. There are more, a lot more." The air in the courtroom thickened. Reporters scribbled furiously. The jury leaned forward, eyes wide. The defense attorneys, once so smug, sat stiff and silent. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge anymore. This was bigger. Pam took one last look at Lawson, then turned to face the entire courtroom. The jurors, the reporters, the people watching from the gallery. Her voice carried, clear and strong. No one is above the law. It wasn't just a statement. It was a warning, a promise. The trial would continue, But the real fight was only beginning. As the courtroom buzzed with energy, cameras flashing and whispers filling the air, one image stood out: the judge's seat. Empty. The symbol of a system that had protected the powerful for too long. But not anymore.